The theme for the rest of the day today here in this fourth annual State of the West Symposium is infrastructure. In my mind, as an historian, it's particularly appropriate that we're having a discussion about infrastructure in this region here at Stanford University. Probably the single most iconic infrastructural investment in this region ever, going back over historical time, was the Transcontinental Railroad, which completed in the 1860s, and of course, not only is the first railroad across the continent in North America, but also made Leland Stanford's fortune and laid the foundations for this university. So there's a kind of a closing of the circle here that we're talking about infrastructure in this particular environment. From that day, 150 some years ago until now, in my view, it has been very large scale, highly ambitious, and mostly government sponsored, indeed mostly federal government sponsored, large scale infrastructural investments that have made this region what it is today, conspicuously including things like not only the Transcontinental Railroad of the 19th century, but the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, and the myriad water projects that have harnessed every major river in this region, beginning with the Hoover Dam across the Colorado River in 1935, Grand Coulee 1940s, Glen Canyon in the 1960s, every major river system in this region, from the Snake Columbia system to the Sacramento, the Upper Missouri, and of course the Colorado River system, arguably the most managed river in the world, have been harnessed to make life in this region possible on the scale that maybe too frequently we take for granted. Now, in this connection to the water projects, the regional plumbing system that we live with, here too it happens there is a pretty direct Stanford connection. Going back to something called the Searsville Dam. How many people in this room have any acquaintance at all with the existence of the Searsville Dam? Okay, all the locals know what we're talking about. It's a dam constructed in the 1880s on San Francisco Creek, about 7 or 8 miles due west of here. And the Stanford connection is that it's on Stanford land, and Stanford now owns it. There's a current movement to breach that dam. That's a highly controversial matter. But the dam was originally built by something called the Spring Valley Water Company in the 1880s, the CEO of which was a man by the name of Francis G. Newlands. Francis Newlands went on to become a senator from the state of Nevada, and he became the sponsor of what's sometimes called the Newlands Act, otherwise known as the Reclamation Act of 1902, which created the Bureau of Reclamation, which became the first and most important government agency that harnessed all these western rivers. So there is a kind of a direct genealogy, you might say, or a genealogical line that connects that little dam out there on San Francisco Creek to Hoover and Grand Coulee and Glen Canyon and Shasta and all the rest of them. Now today, that regional plumbing system, which is arguably at considerable risk. The system we have, region-wide, was first conceived and designed by men, almost all of them men, born in the 19th century. They were men working with late 19th and early 20th century scientific data, and they built these major projects that I've just mentioned using early and mid-20th century engineering techniques. So our subject today is whether or not this plumbing system is showing signs of obsolescence and whether or not it needs the kind of attention that it deserves if the health and future of this system, which is so vital to our region's well-being, is to continue. We have a particularly distinguished panel here with us this afternoon to discuss this. I'm going to introduce all three of them at once here in the order in which they're going to take voice. And after their presentations, of course, we'll have some general discussion and ample opportunity, I'm sure, for questions and comments from all of you. So our first speaker is Jonathan Foley. Jonathan Foley is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin with degrees in atmospheric science and meteorology. He taught at the University of Wisconsin as well, where he founded the Center for Sustainability and the Global Environment, and then he spent the last several years at the University of Minnesota as the director of the Institute on the Environment. Those of you who subscribe to National Geographic magazine may have seen the cover story last spring, May 2014, in which Jonathan had the lead article on the new food revolution, especially an article called A Plan to Feed 9 Billion, and you know who you are. I'm especially proud to say that I served on the committee of the trustees of the California Academy of Sciences that invited John last spring to become the new executive director of the California Academy, another historic Western institution founded in 1853, a full decade before the founding of the National Academy of Sciences. And John accepted our offer, and he is now, as of just a few weeks ago, the executive director of the California Academy of Sciences. So welcome to California, and welcome to Stanford, John. Our second panelist is Patricia Mulroy. She is no stranger to this campus, and she is surely no stranger to water issues. She was instrumental in helping the Bill Lane Center for the American West and the Woods Institute for the Environment several years ago lay down the planning for what is now the largest collaboration between the Woods Institute and the Lane Center project called Water in the West. We convened two what we call uncommon dialogues, brought stakeholders and policymakers from around the region to tell us what kinds of things we could do here at Stanford that would mobilize university-based research to find solutions to the region's water problems. And Pat Mulroy was absolutely critical to those discussions. For more than 2 decades, she was the general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority and the Las Vegas Valley Water District. She has long been a leader and a rarely shy, let me correct that, never shy voice in Western water matters, and she is currently a senior fellow at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas Brookings Mountain West Institute. And welcome back, Pat, to Stanford. Our third panelist is David Hayes, also no stranger to this campus. David took his law degree here in 1978, and in my view, David Hayes is the very model of a modern civil servant. He has twice served as Deputy Secretary of the Interior, first in the Clinton administration between 1997 and 2001, and then again in the Obama administration from 2009 to 2013, where, among other things, he championed what he calls landscape scale planning, something that's very dear to us at the Lane Center because part of our mission is to encourage people to think at regional scales whenever possible and not just in terms of local or state or even watershed scales for that matter. I'm very pleased to say also that David has agreed as of a year or so ago to join the Advisory Council for the Bill Lane Center for the American West. So thank you for that, David, and welcome to this panel today. So with that, I'm going to turn the stage over to our speakers, and after they have said what they have to say, we'll have some more general discussion. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, David, for the very kind introduction and the opportunity to be here. When David asked me to be on this panel, I was a little, taken aback, saying, well, I'm coming from St. Paul, and we can't even say we're on the west side of the Mississippi River, like our previous speaker. So I'm not really from the American West until about 2 months ago. And also, I'm not really a hydrologist or kind of water policy person, so I'll try to instead really frame this in maybe some other ways of thinking about water in the North American West, in maybe the context of other global environmental issues. And I know our other two panelists are far more adept at talking about water issues in much more specificity than I can. But I think together maybe we'll look at this problem from many different points of view, and I hope we can have a good session today. Well, here we are in California. We certainly have a water problem here. There's no doubt about that. We're also seeing, of course, historically for many, many years, what's happening to our Colorado River, another American West water resource, or what's happening in Sao Paulo, or what's happening in Lake Chad, or the Aral Sea, or I could keep going for a long time. So it appears, at least anecdotally, that we might be having many more water problems than we've had previously. Is that true? Short answer, yes, it is. We now know from very good scientific observations around the world that our stocks of water, what we have in groundwater, what we have in snow and ice, what we have in our surface water systems is dramatically declining. We can even measure that in the distortion of the Earth's gravitational field as measured by satellites in an experiment called the GRACE experiment run out of JPL. That's kind of extraordinary. They can even detect it from space, that our water resources are declining, and that's steadily continuing to occur. So if it is happening, then why? Well, the why is for really two fundamental reasons, but I think they're important to step back and ask, exactly why and what their relative magnitudes. One is, I call it the inflection point. It's that the fact in the last 50 years, we've done more to change our planet than all human history combined. Okay? In our one lifetime, we've done more than all previous lifetimes who ever walked the earth in total. What we did, well, we doubled our population. We grew our population 100%. We grew our economy sevenfold. So twice as many people doing 7 times more stuff. We eat 3 times more food than we did 50 years ago. We use 4 times more fossil fuels annually than we did 50 years ago. All of those things together mean that we, as a globe, consume about 3 times more water annually than we did just one lifetime ago. So that's pretty astonishing. We just lived through the single biggest explosion in human activity, and water tripled during that one lifetime. And of course, as David mentioned, we're dealing with infrastructure that was largely designed several lifetimes ago in a wholly different planet, in a wholly different civilization, and it's out of date. So that's one really big problem. The second, of course, is the planet itself is changing too. We've changed a lot, and now the planet's beginning to change as well. I'm speaking, of course, of climate change, but that's not the only thing that's happening. Land use change in our watersheds, the composition of our atmosphere, the mixture of plants and animals in the landscape, all of these different things. But the elephant in the room, of course, is climate change. And we're just seeing the early glimpses of that, and it's quite troubling already. Certainly the planet is warmer. A warmer planet is immediately, directly, and very unequivocally responsible for the reduction of snow and ice. One of the great reservoirs for water in places like this. We need snow, we need ice. So that's a direct impact. Those warmer temperatures also increase the rates of evaporation and transpiration, the water that comes out of through plants. So that's another kind of effect on our water resources. We're demanding more, sucking it into the warmer air above the earth. Maybe, and this is the part that we can still debate, maybe even precipitation patterns have started to change. There's pretty good, but not totally unequivocal evidence that we have more intense rainfalls in kind of when it's raining and more gaps between the rains. So we have maybe more floody periods and more extended dry periods, all occurring within a warmer atmosphere with less snow and less ice. So you take those two things together. One is the explosion of human activity and the demands for water, which is the big part of the equation so far, and then a warmer, more variable atmosphere in terms of what the hydrologic cycle is doing, and you've just created a perfect storm. You've created a system that is just unbelievable in terms of doing everything it could do to make water resources a big challenge. And we're just getting started. And it's happening very, very quickly at a rate we've never seen in human civilization before. So that's really the big problem, I'd argue, that perfect storm of human activity and a planetary activity colliding faster than anything we've ever seen in our civilization. So well, how do we get into this kind of trouble, and how do we think about moving forward? Well, our next two panelists are far more an expert on water policy than I ever will be, but I just have a few thoughts about this that might be useful to frame the issue a little bit. Ben Franklin said, and I think even it's probably an old Scottish proverb before that even I've heard, but that you don't know the wealth, what is it, the quote is, when the well runs dry, you finally learn the wealth of water, or the value of water, right? So we've never really developed, except in a crisis mentality, good policy and economic frameworks for water. Why is that, I wonder? It's probably for a couple of reasons. One is water is by far our oldest resource. It predates the invention of fire. It predates the invention of agriculture. I mean, by millions of years, by the way. So, or billions, really. But in terms of our human resource of water, early hominids used water. We've always used water well before any other kind of resource. We've never really made kind of a decision of whether water is really a commodity, or is it a human right, or is it a utility? Is it a service provider? What is it exactly? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? What is it? We agree it's H2O now. But actually, for many centuries, we didn't even know what water truly was. So that's still a question. I think it's reflected in our weird patchwork of economic and policy kind of structures for water that actually bear no resemblance to the laws of physics. The hydrologic cycle works a certain way. It's fueled by the sun, water moves across the land. We can use it in a very short amount of time when it fell from the sky, and when it touches the ocean, that's it. And that's a tiny little part of the hydrologic cycle, and none of our policies really reflect that very well. So we've got some reconciliation to do between our kind of governing framework for water and the laws of physics. And that's how we got into a lot of this trouble. Some of the challenges, though, of course, is that water is also the largest volume thing we use on the planet. It's massive and it's heavy, okay? We use about, well, maybe 8,000 cubic kilometers of water are consumed on planet Earth every year. That's out of the 40,000 cubic kilometers that flow across the Earth's surface annually. I'm measuring this not in gallons, but in cubic kilometers. Imagine a kilometer on a side. I could use miles, I guess, but okay, for the non-Americans in the audience, we'll use kilometers. Yeah, the U.S. is, I guess Burma and Liberia are the only other countries that still don't use the metric system, so I don't get that. Acre feet per fortnight, maybe that's what I should use. But anyway, no, just kidding. But we're talking about massive quantities of water, and it's just never going to be practical from a purely physics point of view to transport major shares of our water consumption from one part of the Earth to the other. We've done impressive engineering projects moving from one basin to the other, but it's not likely we're going to go mine Antarctica to get water to, let's say, California. That just is not really going to be very physically feasible in our lifetime or ever. Just given the scale of the water resource. So instead we move water through its virtual presence, mainly in the form of food, or in products, or in energy. Things are much, much, much smaller, and we move those instead, and we call that kind of virtual water. But when we think about water, I like to think about water as more the verb than the noun. We can look at water, we can put it in a glass, we can hold it, we can carry it around, but I like to think of it as a service provider, and maybe that's a framework that could be helpful for us as we have this conversation today. If you think about water as the verb, let's say, as the service provisioning tool, kind of like electricity. Nobody cares about electricity. What they care about is light. And they care about heat and the ability to turn on your TV. They want it to be reliable. They want it to be renewable. They want it to always be there. But how many of you give a damn about an electron moving through a wire? Well, unless you're an electrical engineer, you probably don't care much. But what you do care about is the service it provides you. Same thing with water. Yes, it's an important noun, but the services it provides is really the key. So the big services that water provides us, of course, first and foremost, and to first order, this is the biggest, is food. Water becomes food. 70% of global water withdrawals, the water we take out of nature and use, is used for one purpose, to irrigate crops. It's 90% of what we call consumptive water use, water we take out of nature that doesn't flow back to its watershed. So either it's 70% or 90%, whether you look at the gross or net use of water globally. In this part of the world and other dry regions, it's even more. So, but to first approximation, water is food. So you got to think about food. Second, of course, water becomes energy. We use it in hydro, but also pretty much every form of energy except wind. And even solar, because you have to make solar panels, uses a lot of water to make them. But water is intimately involved in the production of energy. That's the second largest use of water globally. Third, manufacturing, jobs also. Water creates things we consume. Second, I think, or after that, it produces health. Perhaps, we drink it, we need it to be potable, we use it in our homes for sanitation, for consumption, and so on. That's about fourth or fifth on the list, but it's perhaps the most crucial in many ways. And then, we'd like to leave some water for nature. So as that water flows from, falling from the sky, and then when it touches the ocean, it's going to provide a bunch of services for us. We turn it into food, energy, manufacturing, jobs, human health, and nature. Those are the trade-offs we're going to have to make within that physical system of water powered by the sun moving across our landscape. That's about it. And that's how we have to reconcile policies with physics. And we have to think very, very hard about that. Some tools that might be very helpful to do that, though, are maybe three. I like to think about three kind of mental tools to help us think about those trade-offs. One is explicitly that physical trade-off itself. How much water did we use to turn it into a service? So irrigation, the biggest use of water in the world. Basically, most of the water on the planet going to food. It takes about 1/3 of a liter of water, like one of those little bottles right there, about one of those is needed to make one food calorie through irrigation on Earth today. So if you eat 3,000 calories a day and you are a vegetarian, you're vegan, You eat no animal products whatsoever, and you waste nothing. So you're skinny, you're vegan, and you waste nothing. So imagine that. You would use, about 1,000 liters a day of water to provide your food. That's 250 gallons for us Americans. So that's your food kind of water print out there. That's huge. We eat much, much more water than we could ever drink. Now that's the average, about 1/3 of a liter per calorie. But the amazing opportunity here is that it's a huge spread between the most efficient farmers in the world and the least efficient farmers in the world who irrigate. In fact, that spread is about 10,000 times between the best farmers and the worst farmers. Even at the national level, India is about 10 times worse than the global average at taking water and turning it into food. As an entire country, the second most populous nation on earth. And let's add Pakistan for the hell of it. And then they're the most populous two countries, if you add them as a single unit, bigger than China. They are the least efficient places in the world turning water into food. 10 times more water to produce the same amount of food than the global average. That's amazing. At the other extreme would be Israel. It's about maybe more than 10 to 20 times better than the global average. So between the most efficient country and the least efficient country, you have about a 100 to 200 fold, not percent, fold difference in how much water it takes to grow food. If I had a company over here that used 100 times more resources to produce the same thing as another one over here, which one would you want to work on? Well, everybody, the rational person would say, I want to work with the more efficient company. I'm going to be, no, I want to work with the least efficient company because they have the headroom to be better. The good thing about being really inefficient is you have nowhere to go but better. So, Israel probably can't get much better, but India and Pakistan can get a hell of a lot better. That's the first rule. When you're doing something dumb, stop. And, that works. So that's a huge, huge issue. Incidentally, India uses about half of the irrigation water on the planet by itself. Yeah, one country is half the irrigation water on Earth. All the other countries in the world combined are the other half. You have a region that is declining in snow and ice, beginning to see issues of climate change, rapidly growing population, 2 nuclear-armed nations that have close to, gone to war several times before, and we have contest over water. But it's the least efficient water use on the planet. Maybe we should pay attention to that. So while there's a big issue around water, the opportunity for efficiency around a service provisioning lens is huge. We're not talking just a few percent, we're talking orders of magnitude change in how we use water to produce what we want from it. The US is somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, but we have a long way to go to be in the best of class. Second issue is probably the renewability of water. We can't call all water the same. Not every drop of water is the same. Some of it falls from the sky yesterday and we can use it today, and it'll come back tomorrow. It's a highly renewable resource in the fact that it's being renewed on a continuous basis, like maybe in the Amazon. There's plenty of water and it's going to come back tomorrow. Contrast that with the Aguela aquifer. When did that water get there? 20,000 years ago was the last time that really was being recharged. So no matter what you do, unless you wait for the next ice age, that's an unsustainable use of water. It makes, regardless of how efficient it is, it's inherently non-renewable. So that's a real problem. Surface waters may be more renewable if you're lucky, if you don't overtax them, but these deep ancient aquifers are essentially a one-time endowment, and you've mined it, and you will never get it back, and it doesn't grow any interest. So what do you do then? That's a huge issue. The third issue is maybe looking for what I like to call kind of planet levers. There are places around the planet where you have these trade-offs and you have non-renewability, and they're tightly concentrated in particular economic sectors and particular kind of geographic locations. They're the 80-20 rules, where 80% of the problem is in 20% of the system, let's say. I mentioned India. India is half the irrigation consumption in the world, and it's the least efficient country in turning water into food. That's a pretty big opportunity. Add India, China, and the United States, those three in that order, you've got about 75% of all of the irrigation on Earth happens in 3 countries. And then you look at those crops, and about 3 crops dominate that, or about 80% of that, and they're wheat, rice, and corn. So to first order, most of the water used in the world is used by 3 countries to make 3 things: rice, wheat, and corn, in India, China, and the United States. That's about 60% of all the water on Earth is on one hand. So that's a planet lever. You want to fix water? Start there. That's in terms of volumes. That would be a big place to do it. Other places could be looked at more regionally within particular watersheds, and places, of course, water being a hyper-local resource, use that same kind of thinking within your watershed, within the American West, and you may find other opportunities. Where is the 80-20 rule in thinking about all of this? So I'll just wrap up, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions later by just saying I would encourage us to really think about water, again, like a physical system of a renewable resource that is just basically traveling from the mountaintop to the ocean, kind of like electrical current. You only have so much of it. You can only power it so much, and that's the sun. We're not going to change that. And it's getting a little more sporadic because of climate change. We can choose to use it to do certain things, grow food, we can make manufacturing, make energy, we can have healthy water for cities and so on, and we can leave some for nature. And in many cases, we may not be able to do all 5 of those in the way we currently are. And that's where the opportunity to really look at not water as a commodity, but rather as a service provisioning tool like electricity, you have a very different perspective, and where I think you can zoom in on really bad trade-offs that could be made much better, and look very carefully at these kind of leverage points where 80-20 or 90-10 rules show you how we could do much, much better in thinking about governing this resource, which we've done historically not a very good job of as a civilization, and we're going to get better on that very, very quickly. So with that, I'll stop, and I'd love to hear from people who really know something about water, and we'll have a real debate about that later on. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I always love coming up to Stanford and love participating in these events. And as I was listening to John, it took me back to what I just came back from last night. Over the last 4 days, I've been in Dubai at the World Economic Forum, sitting on the World Water Council for the forum. And everything that he said about India and Pakistan is absolutely correct. And there was a lot of conversation around it. For Davos, water is going to be the number 3 issue on the agenda. It has risen out of obscurity in the global agenda to take 3rd place in terms of the significant item affecting global economic viability and the state of the human population across the planet. And climate change, obviously, is one of the major drivers, which collides very quickly with a population which is expected to top 11 billion by 2050, which would incrementally increase our population again by leaps and bounds. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to bring you back from the planet back to the American West and talk. I'm going to take you to the end of my conversation here before I even start. We've become infrastructure averse in this country. We have all sorts of organizations that want to prevent anything from being built anywhere. And I am a firm believer that we are not going to be able to survive what climate change brings us without significantly retooling existing infrastructures and adding to our infrastructure inventory. Having said that, however, I do think the exercise that we're going through here in the short term, which is to impose a level of discipline on how we use our already sizable investment in infrastructure, is a healthy one, and will go a long way to averting perhaps what might become less than necessary projects. In talking about the American West, I'm going to hone in particularly my favorite subject, the Colorado River, and the 7 basins and 2 countries that comprise this basin. Take it as an illustrative example, or look at it more as something that very immediately affects Californians, Nevadans, Arizonans, those from Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico. I am going to start again at the end and say the single most important piece of infrastructure to save the Colorado River and to help it come into balance is for California to find resolution around the Bay Delta. Now let me tell you why I say that. We think of ourselves as citizens of a country. We think of ourselves as citizens of a state. We think of ourselves as citizens of a community. We do not think of ourselves as citizens of a basin. And in this basin, it takes the externality that it way bleeds outside what would be the natural hydrograph of the Colorado River. We plumbed it that way. That is what our infrastructure legacy is from the beginning of the 20th century. Let's start looking at what we have in this basin. You see all these nice little red marks outside the basin? That's where we send the water from the Colorado River to. In the state of Colorado, we move it across the Continental Divide from the west slope of the Colorado River to the front range of the Colorado River, of the state of Colorado, to Denver, Aurora, Boulder, and to any number of agricultural districts that sit in the Kansas-Nebraska watershed. The Platte, the Arkansas, all those rivers that run to the east. Even in Wyoming, we move it out of the watershed and we move it to Cheyenne. Come down to the state of Utah. We move it across the Utah desert to the Wasatch Front, to Salt Lake, Provo, Orem, not in the Colorado River watershed. Come down to New Mexico. We move it from the Colorado River watershed to the Rio watershed by moving it to Albuquerque. Come down to Arizona, 380 miles of the Central Arizona Project, move water from Lake Havasu to the central cities of Arizona, now comprising a significant portion of their water supply. And here in California, we in Nevada love to say we have the only city that actually sits on the Colorado River. In the state of California, we move it from Lake Havasu on the other side through Metropolitan's facilities to 20 million people in Southern California, all the way from Santa Barbara down to San Diego. When you combine this in economic terms, I've heard the number of 27% of the country's GDP represented by one meager system, and I'm going back. We love acre feet in the West, John. I know you're a newcomer here. Learn to love it. We don't let go of acre feet. Just to put it into perspective, we thought the river had 18 million. Today, I think, optimistically, we hope we can get 14 out of it in what would be called a, quote, normal year. What we based it on was 50 years of the wettest hydrology the river system had seen. That meager system supports that entire economy. Where the Mississippi and the Missouri come together, 436 million acre feet of water go past that point every single year. That's the relative difference in water supply and the relative difference in size of magnitude of what we're talking about here. Now, this intricate plumbing system that we have built has served us well. It has been at the heart of many a lawsuit. It has been at the heart of a lot of Western lore, a lot of folklore and lore that maybe has a little bit more basis in fact. But there's been an evolution that's been happening over the last 20 years, which I love sitting on panels with David, because David and I started this journey together. He and Bruce Babbitt helped break through the gridlock of 7 cultures in the Colorado River, 7 very disparate states. And I will always say thank you to my friend David. Herding us, as he will readily be happy to tell everybody, was like herding cats. But these 7 states have been able to accomplish miracles over the last 20 years. And it lays a foundation and puts us in a better place than many, if not most, other places on the planet in terms of our ability to adapt and our ability to survive. And California is key to that survival. When we began our journey, we began a process of looking at all our infrastructure together. We're a mosaic a mosaic made up of various pieces of infrastructure that all have to function in tandem with one another. And each piece is dependent on the others. I'm not going to go into what we signed in 2000 because today it almost sounds silly, which is the interim surplus guidelines. But, and I remember lovingly my arguments with then Secretary Babbitt about why are we talking about surpluses when we should be talking about shortages. And he wisely said to me, Pat, we're not ready. We're not ready to have that shortage discussion. Well, along comes 2000, and we in Nevada had developed this, we have this discipline. When we created the Southern Nevada Water Authority, we developed a discipline where every year we develop a 50-year resource plan. Every single year, by December, we have to adopt a new 50-year resource plan that takes into account any economic changes, any hydrologic changes, anything that may have happened that affects water demands and water usage in our area. 2000, I took a 50-year resource plan to the Water Authority Board that gave us a 50-year robust supply off the Colorado River. In 2002, nothing. Nothing. It disappeared before our eyes. Lake Mead had dropped to a level where we couldn't take additional water. Our neighbors in Arizona, who had committed to bank unused Arizona water in their groundwater basins for our future use, said they didn't have any extra available because they were scrambling to put together as many resources as they could to deliver to their own cities and bank on behalf of their own cities. And what made that scary for us, that document is attached to every bond offering in Southern Nevada and in the state of Nevada, and it's attached to every SEC filing for every corporation in the state of Nevada, because water is that difficult a resource and that scarce a resource for us. So we took a ship and we turned it around, and we, the river community, began the most difficult discussions we've ever had. Shortage guidelines. And what was really interesting during those shortage discussion, all our infrastructure had to be on the table. Now, we still postured because we'd spent a lot of money going to the Supreme Court, right? And there wasn't a lot of political capital to be gained to admit to our constituents that we really hadn't gotten what we thought we had. I have often told my friends in Arizona, did you really win Arizona v. California? All you did was ignite the California fire that then went to Congress and forced the subordination of the Central Arizona Project to all of California's uses. So at the end of the day, you really ended up with nothing. Those kind of confrontations have never gotten us anywhere. And it was that recognition that things were changing as quickly as they were on this river system, and that going to court was a long, drawn-out process and that failure was not an option, that got us to the 2007 shortage guidelines, whereby Nevada and Arizona each take cuts as Lake Mead's levels go down. And when I talk about Lake Mead's levels, let's look how bad it is. This reservoir has a capacity of 1,200, is full at sea level elevation 1220. It will end this water year at 1079, 4 feet above the first shortage declaration ever in the Colorado River Basin. That's what the intake towers at Hoover Dam look like. That little white ring, that's the water line. That's what it looks like today. And for those of us who live on this lake and who look at it every single day, it's a pretty scary proposition. But in 2007, we put lots of different tools into place. And again, existing infrastructure was being maximized. Our friends in Arizona guaranteed Nevada that they would bank 1.2 million acre-feet of unused Arizona water in their groundwater basins for our shortage protection and for our future use. we would pay them $350 million for that. Just the cost to cover the cost of recharge, and the extraction costs were over and above that. We agreed for the first time, and this one is really key, especially here in the short term, that we could go out and effectuate conservation by paying agricultural areas to rotationally fallow a portion of their crops and leave that water in Lake Mead, and we could then use it when and if the system was not in shortage. So between Metropolitan, the Central Arizona Project, and SNWA, we began to spend money on the river to bring this reservoir back up again. We also agreed that there are 3 elevations in Lake Mead at which shortages will be declared: 1075, 1050, and elevation 1000. To put elevation 1000 in real-term perspective for you, at elevation 1000, there is less than 5 million acre-feet left in a reservoir that holds 25 million and that has an annual demand of 9.5 to 10 million. That's serious. So avoiding elevation 1000 is all important. Involving getting to any of those shortage levels is all important. You got to remember, Mead's a V. The further you go down in the reservoir, the faster the rate of decline. And 1075 is one of those linchpin elevations where the rapidity at which that reservoir declines really starts escalating. Southern Nevada's first intake happens to sit at 1050, so it's near and dear to our heart as well, but that's a whole nother story. All those pieces came together, and as difficult as that agreement was, and we agreed to re-operate Lake Powell and Lake Mead, which operate in tandem with one another. We did it. We all signed that agreement, and we all said we would live with it. But guess what's happening? Climate change's impacts on the system are occurring faster than we can react. It's not the continuation of the drought, it's the rate at which it's worsening that is the real scary proposition for us. That being said, what is now being looked at is to again utilize these reservoirs and use them again to prop them up through partnerships with the agricultural community. And in between 2007 and today, where the rate of decline is just increasing, we did one other thing that was all important. We signed Minute 319 with the federal government and the country of Mexico. Getting to Minute 319 was really difficult. It was the ultimate collision of the Compact Clause of the Constitution with the Treaty Clause of the Constitution. The United States has primacy in all treaty matters, but they have no water on the river with which to negotiate. That is held in trust by the states. It had to bring the states and the federal government together. And thanks to David's efforts of convincing the State Department to let the states into the room, Minute 319 became possible because the states knew they could stop it. Minute 319 brought Mexico as a full partner. Mexico can now fallow land in Mexico and use a United States facility for their drought protection. They can store Mexican water in Lake Mead for Mexico's use. They also agreed that we, SNWA, the Metropolitan, and CAP, could go into Mexico and help pay for some of that early fallowing, and in return get a block of water with our name on it. Think about that. The U.S. agencies are buying water in the country of Mexico and storing it in a U.S. facility. Infrastructure that was very territorially protected and was absolutely not for use by anybody but the United States, now is internationally being used. And I think this notion of spreading the benefit of tomorrow's infrastructure is key to making it affordable and viable. The larger the region you can serve, the less infrastructure you have to build. Yes, it may be bigger, but at least you're building less of it. It's costing less in the overall, and it has a much greater utility to it. Today, SNWA, CAP, and MET are out negotiating with agricultural districts to see if they recognize that it's in their best interest as well. I don't know whether you read those stories that appeared in the British press and that seemed to be becoming American folklore, but someone started the rumor that Lake Mead's only beneficiary was Southern Nevada. Nothing could be further from the truth. Southern Nevada is currently building a third intake which will allow it to take water at elevation 860. At 900, nothing goes downstream. Lake Havasu, Southern California, and all of Arizona will not have a drop of Colorado River water well before Southern Nevada loses its Colorado River supply. That's the reality. And the myth that this is a Southern Nevada facility is completely erroneous. Why the Bay Delta? Why is it so imperative for this entire region in the West that California find resolution around the Bay Delta? Because Metropolitan takes 56% of its water from the Bay Delta and 44% from the Colorado. So guess what happened this year? The Sierras were hit by a tremendous drought, but the releases from Glen Canyon down to Lake Mead were the lowest in the history of the river since the building and filling of Lake Powell. So Lake Mead was going to go down way faster than it had ever gone down before. Our neighbors and partners in Southern California, because they got virtually nothing out of the State Water Project, had no choice but to take water out of storage. All that early fallowing that they had done, all those arrangements that they'd entered into, and the water that they had paid and bought and put in Lake Mead, they had to take more out than they otherwise would have, causing an already strained reservoir to fall further, affecting water supply from Nevada all the way down to California and affecting the balance between Mead and Powell. But Met had no choice. You probably didn't realize it because none of us screamed. We knew when they bought it and when they put it in there that this day was going to come. We just didn't know that it would come on during a period of the greatest strain on the river system. This is an interconnected water plumbing system. We built it. You can't have something happen in the Bay Delta that's not felt in Cheyenne. You can't have something happen in Denver, the consequences of which are not felt in Phoenix. We need to think differently and realize that in order to survive, all of our strengths have to be on the table to buffet against each one of our weaknesses. Relationships amongst the states and between the partners, they're not hunky-dory. We can still sit at the table and throw spitballs at each other, but that's okay. We can get past it and we can move on to the next generation. The solution for us is a mosaic of infrastructure and a mosaic of maximizing existing infrastructure. The toughest challenge we have is convincing our agricultural brethren that we're not their enemies, that we can help them make on-farm efficiency, pay for on-farm efficiencies today that will benefit them in the future, and that we're partners in this. That there is no way we can get through it with someone being a winner and someone being a loser. That's a 19th century concept that has to fall by the wayside. Either we all survive, or we all will suffer the consequences of our own inability to get past our history. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always fun following Pat. And Pat is very effective, as you can tell. It reminds me a little bit of a story that Bettina Boxhall of the LA Times wrote a few weeks ago describing a meeting at the Interior Department that I happened to be chairing when I was the Deputy Secretary. And it wasn't about the Colorado River, it was about a California related issue. And there was a quote in there describing one of the representatives of the water interests as being akin to Nikita Khrushchev and taking his shoe off and pounding it on the lectern and then walking out. That was the early Pat Mulroy. She's come a long way, and we're very lucky for it. So I'm going to broaden the lens a little bit. I just have about 10 slides, so don't despair, and then we'll get to the discussion. So the topic is moving water in the West and talking about infrastructure. I'm going to broaden the lens a little bit, and then ironically going to come back to the same end that Pat came to. So the key issues in terms of moving water in the West, I would say, are defining the need, looking at what kinds of infrastructure options there are and what some of the confounding factors are in terms of adding infrastructure, and the evolving federal role. So in terms of defining the need, first need is just actually that our current infrastructure is aging. Many of our major water projects, many of them built by the federal government and the Bureau of Reclamation through the Interior Department, are aging. Hoover Dam was built in the 1930s. Here in California, the federal water project was built in the 1930s also. The state water project was built in the 1960s, at a time when California had about 15 million people instead of today's 39 million people. It's aging. And more broadly, the drinking water systems of our country are aging incredibly. In fact, it's been estimated that about 16% of the water that is delivered in our drinking water systems are lost due to leaky pipes. That's 7 billion gallons a day. Many systems are 100 years old, and the estimate is that it would take $11 billion a year just to maintain existing drinking water systems. So we've got aging infrastructure. We've got population growth, big time. This is particularly a Western issue, I would have to say, and we have an unfortunate sort of coincidence of the West being dry and also being incredibly population building quickly. For example, I've got a couple of statistics here somewhere. Here we are. There was a recent program that Water for the West and the Woods Institute put on with Brookings that had a terrific sort of cheat sheet about some facts. And here's one. 5 of the 10 fastest growing states between 2000 and 2010 each receive on average less than 20 inches of precipitation per year. So half of our fastest growing states are states that are very dry. And the trend's projected to continue. The driest region of the country, which includes Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, are expected to grow by approximately 45% between 2010 and 2040. Second driest region, and California really shouldn't be put in the same basket as Oregon and Washington, but there it is projected to grow substantially by 33% in the next 10 years. So this is the need for infrastructure. Climate change, we talked about climate change. The interesting thing about climate change is that some of the infrastructure that we built for the previous climate doesn't work quite so well anymore. What's one of the things we're seeing about climate change? We're seeing less snowpack, less of that natural reservoir, more water coming in rain, losing basically reservoir, needing to replace the snow reservoirs that we've had. And then, of course, you've got the heat. And I thought John did a very nice job of discussing the fact that just the rising temperatures alone have a significant impact on water availability, drought regardless, even if you had the same precipitation rates because of the evaporation, et cetera. Also, changing ag practices are defining a need for infrastructure. This is particularly true in California, where in some of the driest and lowest priority areas in terms of water supplies, you are finding farmers, understandably, moving to higher value crops that use quite a bit of water, and that where you lose some flexibility. Some of the things that Pat were talking about were encouraging farmers when needed to potentially fallow their lands and provide that water to, say, urban areas like, for example, Las Vegas, when needed. Well, when ag practices are turning into more permanent crops, as in California with pistachios, with almonds, with walnuts, that you cannot fallow on a year-to-year basis, you are losing some flexibility. And that's why you're seeing in this drought year some ag districts south of the Delta paying $1,000 or more, $2,000 an acre foot for water because they want to keep their trees alive in the hope that next year we'll have some water. And just by way of example, one pistachio takes almost a gallon of water to be produced. One almond takes 1.1 gallons of water to be produced. One walnut takes almost 5 gallons of water to be produced. A head of lettuce is equivalent to 3 almonds. And one tomato is equivalent to 3 almonds. And you don't have to plant the lettuce and the tomatoes if you need flexibility. The almond trees come at a cost if you're not going to water them. Also, we have a new need, a recognition of the environment as an important factor in how we allocate our water. Something also mentioned by both speakers. And we have really kind of messed up our environment due to a plethora of reasons, but just take fish resources in California. Peter Moyle, the probably preeminent fish biologist at the University of California, Berkeley, we can say that here at Stanford, says that out of the 122 fish species in California, fully 73% of them are either listed as endangered, recommended for listing as endangered, or viewed as vulnerable. Also, we're losing our wetlands, which provide green infrastructure and resiliency, as well as supply environmental benefits for fowl, et cetera. So we've got a need for new infrastructure. So what are the options? Well, first, we've got the traditional tools. And this is sort of the knee-jerk reaction by many water buffaloes. Well, what we need to do are build some more surface water reservoirs, build some pipelines to move water from water-rich areas to water-needy areas. And clearly, there is some room for new reservoirs. But there are some major constraints also about the new reservoirs and sort of traditional large infrastructure. First, we know that when you build a reservoir on a river system, you can have a big impact in terms of the environment, obviously. We've cut off, as David mentioned at the very outset, many of our, this state's traditional salmon streams, and that's true throughout the West. Also, it's very expensive. New reservoirs, surface reservoirs. In fact, the Water for the West program, Nusha Ajami, under Leon Shepetsky's direction and supervision, did. She'd object to that, actually. By the way, I wouldn't say supervision. Okay, I won't say that publicly, Leon. She did analysis that suggested that actually groundwater storage and conjunctive use, the kind of thing Pat was talking about that Arizona does through the Central Arizona Project, is 6 times cheaper than building new reservoirs. And then you've got the question of, actually, will we fill up these reservoirs? What do the data show us? And you saw from Pat's dramatic pictures that we can't necessarily count on the big expectations of major precipitation events to fill up reservoirs. And so we have to be thinking about some new tools as well. And what are some of the new tools? Well, conjunctive use, the notion that actually we should manage our surface water and our groundwater together, that's something that only recently has dawned on the state of California, as it thankfully finally passed legislation this year for the first time, setting up a system to regulate groundwater. Traditionally, when there's a drought, as we have had here, there is tremendous a pull on the groundwater resources, and we have subsidence, we have wells that have gone dry because they're not deep enough. We have an unsustainable system here. When it's managed together, surface and groundwater, you have the opportunities to do what the state of California did, because Governor Bruce Babbitt in the 1980s got this and passed groundwater legislation, and you're able to bank and recharge aquifers, pull it out, have it work like a physical surface reservoir. New options also have to look at the environmental needs as well, that we can't simply say, okay, we need to pull more water out without regard to the impact on the environment. The folks we work with at UC Davis talk about this as environmental reconciliation rather than necessarily environmental restoration, because we have so engineered many of our water systems that we shouldn't try to get them back to what they were in the beginning, but instead work with the realities of what we have and identify ways that we can have those systems mimic some natural characteristics and help the fish resources and other environmental services that are necessary for our water systems. Then we've got water efficiency and conservation with irrigation systems, mentioned before, is a key one. We've got water reuse. Toilet to tap doesn't sound great, but it works pretty darn well. And in fact has been a huge, these in particular have been hugely important for Southern California, and also for Nevada and a number of large cities in particular. We have confounding factors about applying these new infrastructure options. Climate change being having both the urgency and also the possibility of looking at different needs for different types of infrastructure. And very importantly, and I want to just dwell for 1 minute on this, we've got some very significant governance challenges in terms of working together to address water infrastructure needs. I would say the Colorado River cooperation that's occurred among the states and with the federal government and now with the government of Mexico is head and shoulders leading the way in terms of demonstrating that we can provide good collective governance. But it wasn't always easy. Again, picture early Pat Mulroy with the shoe, the high heel on the table. And it came from a recognition of that we're all in it together. That's hard to do when you have as fragmented a governance system as we have in the United States when it comes to water. 250 million of our approximately 300 million Americans are governed by more than 4,000 different water systems. The last 50 million are governed by 50,000 water systems. So planning, cooperation is not easy. We've got pricing issues. And the interesting thing, and this came out at the very good Brookings Stanford symposium a couple of weeks ago, economists just say, hey, we just got to price water differently and get the right incentives for savings, et cetera. Well, these literally 50,000, and California about 3,000 different jurisdictions are typically small jurisdictions that have elected boards, that are responsive to the local communities, that set the prices, and you don't have the kind of ability to separate out and perhaps rise above the local communities who don't want their water rates to go up. Just a challenge. And again, to get all water rates in a regional area to be moving in the right direction, very challenging. And you've got a system of limited private investment, which is a huge problem because traditionally these public works were largely, very significantly financed by the federal government, which doesn't have the kind of money it had. in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and the kind of imperative that there was that the federal government should put money in this area. And then you've got local water agencies with traditionally floating bonds, et cetera, to pay for their infrastructure. There's very little private investment here in water. You have energy that moved in a completely different direction with regulatory oversight, but publicly owned companies and private investment. And water, that hasn't happened. And so when you're talking about major new infrastructure, how do we get the private sector involved? I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Finally, the evolving federal role. So the feds are not as important as they used to be, which I know is really disappointing to everybody here. But they're still around when it comes to water in the West because of the legacy projects, the major dams and irrigation projects throughout the West that are largely run by the Bureau of Reclamation, but the Army Corps of Engineers also has some major projects, obviously. And then there's a major regulatory role in terms of the Endangered Species Act in particular, also the Federal Power Act. FERC regulates hydro power generation, and the feds come in as a sometimes not very welcome cop on the beat in terms of the environment. And I think actually there's an evolving now federal role of perhaps the federal government helping to deal with what is one of the most destabilizing aspects of this whole issue of infrastructure and in the West, which is the impacts of climate change, which we really are desperately trying to understand in more granularity. And the feds have access to data, to analysis on a regional basis. Some of the best work, I would say, the Bureau of Reclamation has done in recent years under a law that was passed under Jeff Bingaman's tutelage in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee in the mid-2000s, is getting the federal government to help collect data and use the data it has collected and then work them into models, climate models, to help understand what specific regions are going to be seeing in terms of impacts on their water supplies. And they've done very good work in a half dozen or more basins already, and providing basin planning assistance as well. So the feds are going to have to be, and it's a good thing, more of a partner than a teacher or a teller. The new financing realities, I alluded to this a minute ago. The fact is that the feds are now going to be a junior partner. It's interesting, the traditional model and the model that is slow to change but is going to have to change more quickly is that the feds pay the lion's share of major new infrastructure. It's been changing. In fact, Title 16, which is the law that facilitates the funding of metropolitan water reuse projects, requires the local share to be 75% and the federal share to be 25%. The Water Smart program that we began in the beginning of the Obama administration, which has been hugely successful and has saved over 1 million acre-feet of water to date, has a 65% non-federal share. This is tough, though, for many regions in the West, not so much here in California or Nevada, but areas in the Dakotas, for example, in Montana, where there's a huge need for rural water projects that are extraordinarily expensive. There are about 15 major authorized federal rural water projects that will cost between $200 and $400 million a piece to build out. The total, if they were all built, the total cost would be $2.7 billion, serving 1 million people. These are folks in the West who have very little access to good water. Feds can't pay 80% or 90% of those costs. This is going to be a major challenge for many many regions in the West. We're going to move to a more of a competitive merit-based federal assistance approach. I think this is a good thing, and that's already started actually with these rural water projects. And then keep your eye finally on something called the Build America Initiative, which is pretty much under the radar screen. The president announced this in July. And here's what he said. He said that despite the potential for growth and innovation, the United States is significantly underinvesting in both the maintenance of existing infrastructure and the development of new projects. We need to use every tool at our disposal to lay the foundation for future prosperity and create new jobs, including better coordination between the public and private sectors with respect to infrastructure development and financing in areas such as transportation, water, ports, energy, and broadband, among others. Stay tuned for an announcement within a couple of weeks. This is getting rolling under the supervision of Jeff Zients, who's the chairman of the National Economic Council. I'm hoping that it'll provide a wedge for new thinking on how to deal with water financing that will bring in private money. In California, final couple slides. California, I mentioned California here because although it's only part of the West, it is a big player right now. And the governor has a broad-based water action plan. Many of you just voted on a $7.5 billion bond just last Tuesday. We finally have got groundwater regulation, but probably the biggest unanswered question is the one that Pat mentioned, moving water from north to south. And there's something called the proposed Bay Delta Conservation Plan. And when she talked about the Bay Delta, this is what she was talking about. So 2/3 of the precipitation in California lands above that circle. That circle is where the Sacramento River joins with the San Joaquin River coming from the south, creating what was once an incredibly rich diversity of flora and fauna, now highly engineered, very artificial, but used to move the 2/3 of the water that lands in Northern California down to Southern California. On average, 6 million acre-feet of water a year, the largest water project in the world, the largest pumps in the world. You heard the statistics from Pat that the Colorado River at one point thought that it generated 14 million acres of water a year. Doesn't. This is 6 million acre-feet of water moving from northern to southern California. The problem is that those large pumps, when they're on, they reverse the flow they suck in the salmon and the delta smelt and every other fish imaginable. It's an environmental nightmare. Many efforts have been made to fix it. The Bay Delta Conservation Plan is the last one, which came out of a lot of science reviews in the mid-2000s under Governor Schwarzenegger, and a lot of good scientists suggesting the only way to reconcile the environment in the Bay Delta is to remove some of the water from that delta system as it moves from north to south, hence the tunnels that Jerry Brown is talking about. Very controversial. We're going to see how that plays out. Wrapping up, moving water in the West, the need is clear. Combination of aging systems, population growth, and climate change is quite a trifecta. We do have new options that are available and growing. We've got some leadership emerging in some quarters, Pat Mulroy being Exhibit A, and I'd say Jerry Brown being Exhibit B. Major question, will the culture of water wars, which have died down in the Colorado but are fully alive and well in California, will the water wars kind of culture that I gotta have mine stand in the way of transformational change? And will these governance shortcomings, the fact that we've got to deal with dozens, hundreds, and sometimes thousands of different water agencies to get cooperation, is that going to stand in the way? We'll see. Thank you.
Well, thank you all three. I've got a cluster of questions about the nodal matter of infrastructure I want to address the two of you jointly. But before that, I want to ask Jonathan Foley a question about, I believe there are studies that try to model what would be an optimal pattern of agricultural use of Western landscapes, generally speaking, given the soil types, climate, and water supply. What can you tell us about that? Just for a satellite level view, what should we be doing differently? What should we grow more of, less of? What kind of crop shifting should we do? Are there some crops we should go out of business altogether? What would an ideal model look like?
Well, I'm not going to propose I don't think there's a single optimum. It always depends on the criteria you choose to optimize against. And Usually optimizing against any one is a mistake. Builds a lot of brittleness in the system when you do that. But the things I think you ought to think about in that are really the kinds of trade-offs I was mentioning before, like how many, okay, I'll go with acre feet. How many acre feet of water do you have to invest to produce so many meals for people in America, for example? That ultimately is why we're doing agriculture. And I won't pick on the American West, so I'll move just out of that into the Midwest where I used to live. If you think about meals delivered off of acre of land as opposed to bushels, you get a very different answer. For example, in the upper Midwest, the corn system we have there, and which is largely not irrigated until you get to the western part, at least not perennially, maybe a little bit here and there. You have a system that is using about 100 million acres, about the size of California, is growing corn in this country right now, single biggest crop we have in the US. It's consuming more water, more nutrients, more subsidies than any other agricultural system probably in the world, and produces less food than any other major agricultural system on Earth. If you measure it as food, not bushels. Bushels are different than food. That's the whole point. So if like the average acre of land in the upper Midwest can feed about 7 people every day for a whole year off of what's grown off of an acre, if you were producing food off of it. But what we're doing is we're making ethanol and animal feed instead. In fact, what we actually feed is about maybe 1.5 people instead of 6 off of an Iowa acre, let's say, just to take it away from the West, because I don't want to get in trouble with people here.
Smart move.
Yeah. I don't want to get hit with a shoe. Yeah. No, so that's pretty interesting. And that's about the same as Bangladesh feeds off of their land. Actually, they feed more people off of an acre of land than Iowa does. And it's not because of what you grow, it's what you're using it for. So I think those discussions around like growing almonds versus lettuce versus whatever, it is a little weird that people in Minnesota, where I used to live, would be buying lettuce grown in, let's say, Arizona from the Colorado River. That just seems a little weird until you remember we have winter. So you have these different trade-offs. So I think that's the lens to look at it through, is not productivity ought to be measured really in the social outcome. I think is a better way to look at it is nutritional outcomes per acre foot of water.
Well, just to make it concrete, just focus on one crop just for a moment.
Okay.
Rice.
Yep.
Rice is frequently cited as the biggest consumptive use of water, wasteful use of water in California agriculture. Some reason to believe, I would think, that that's not entirely true. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I think actually you might want to, that's worth the conversation. There are certainly ways you can irrigate rice more efficiently. It doesn't have to be irrigated year-round or not. I mean, that's actually a global conversation, also back to India and Pakistan and other places too. Rice is the biggest consumer of water in the world, not just in California, but it's also the most important staple crop in the world. Rice produces more calories for the human diet than any other crop on Earth. It turns out it's almost all used for human-based calories. Actually, wheat and rice together, just 2 crops, those feed half of the calories of the human diet on the planet. So they're really pretty important. So actually, yeah, when you look at it from a, maybe a volume side, like, well, how many pounds of rice did you grow per pound of water? It doesn't look so great because it needs a lot of water. But in terms of number of people who got calories, rice is fantastic. Whether you want to grow it off of this kind of water in this place, that's a good question. So I think there's a trade-off between the calories delivered versus the water consumed, not bushels to acre feet. That's not the right metric. Right. And secondly, the renewability of the water you invested. Not every gallon of water is the same. So a Colorado River acre foot of water is very different than an Uncle acre foot of water, versus a Sierra foot of water or whatever. Yeah. So I think that's how you have to look at it in a very different way than we usually do.
Okay, thanks. So I leave it up to you two who wants to take the first pass at this, but I have a question directed at both of you. Maybe Pat, I'll direct it to you first. So our topic is infrastructure. All of us probably come into the room with some staple assumptions about what we mean by the word infrastructure. It's dams and canals and pipes and pumps and so on. But as I heard your presentation, Pat, it was mostly about institutional and legal and regulatory and political agreements, which is where the action is. It's that kind of human infrastructure, if I can put it that way, not the physical stuff where we should be investing our energy and our attention. Did I hear you correctly?
Well, I think what I said at the beginning, that right now we're going through a process of kicking the tires on what we have. And you have to address the political and the relationship issues and the laws and governance and all those issues around how we're using existing infrastructure before new infrastructure has any validity. because we're not maximizing its use. I mean, what we've done in this country, and it's not just a Western phenomenon, is we build infrastructure for teeny tiny units, relatively speaking. Those could be maximized. The greatest, where I learned this lesson was when we built $3.5 billion worth of brand new infrastructure with not a dime of federal money in Southern Nevada on a population that was in the 1 million range when we did it, and paid for it all ourselves by spreading the envelope. In other words, we didn't build a turnout to every one of the retail purveyors. We moved turnouts upstream. We shared turnouts. We shared the capacity on this infrastructure. So a system that would have been unaffordable to build instantly became affordable. That's what I'm saying. One of the things that I think climate change is going to bring us is that every piece of infrastructure that we build in the water arena, we won't use every single year. That's a concept that is something we have not ever done, be it in the West or anywhere else, that our infrastructure is going to have to be very adaptive. In other words, if I have a well field over here, I may let that well field go untouched unless I have a critical condition on a surface water system. Then I go back to the well field. In the meantime, I have artificially recharged that well field. I've built infiltration basins. I've built that up as my reservoir. I don't touch it. So I've invested millions, if not billions, in an infrastructure piece that I will only use intermittently, but it will still be built into the rate base. That kind of flexibility to be able to move where you take the water from, I think is going to be all important as we address climate impacts.
David, you seem to be nodding in agreement.
Well, I just, two comments. One is that, to your point, I think that infrastructure needs to be defined broadly here. And there are analogies to the energy sector. If we can save a drop of water, that may be just as good as storing it for when it might be needed. And so truly investment in, for example, more efficient irrigation systems, et cetera, should be thought of, those investments should be thought of as infrastructure, I would say. I also think that the reality is that at all levels of government, there are not the salad days of money flowing off trees anymore. And all infrastructure is being put to a much more vigorous cost-benefit analysis and sharing concept, which I think is very positive. The final thing I'll say about your question was, it went to, is the governance issue as big a problem as the question of the physical piece of this? And I'd say yes. And the reality is that, for example, on the efficiency side, in part because of our legal system, folks who have high priority water rights have no incentive or little incentive to utilize their water very efficiently. In fact, they may lose their water right or part of it if they invest too much in efficient use. So that's a big problem. And ironically, some of the most efficient users are and not surprisingly actually when you think about it, are the most junior folks. So that along with, that's just one example of a legal and governance problem that we face in terms of this issue.
So among the human institutions that we think, people like John Chauvin believe this is part of his civil religion, that we think make for efficiency are well-developed markets.
Yeah.
So the question asks itself, why don't we have efficient water markets? There has been, you're going to know a lot more about this than I do, but I believe there have been federal efforts to stimulate the emergence of markets, especially the Central Valley Project Improvement Act of about 20 years ago now, or 15 years ago. But to my knowledge, they haven't really emerged in any very significant way. So let me focus the question for you. To what extent do you think the lack of better physical infrastructure is an impediment to more efficient water markets where you can really move water across watersheds, across drainages?
You certainly need some infrastructure sometimes for water markets to work, but not always. I mean, water markets typically arise with exchanges, and you can use existing infrastructure, you may not have to move water. You may just basically have it change hands. And this is in California, and Pat can comment on other Colorado states, but in California there's been a huge emergence of a water market. In the last 4 years, because of the drought, and 2009 was a horrible year, largely the ag community came forward and working with the metropolitan water districts of the world really had a robust market where hundreds of thousands of acre feet have been traded. And that's continued through this drought. And there have been significant efforts by the state regulators and by the federal regulators to make that easier. And it's challenging sometimes because there are environmental consequences associated with some of these water transfers. But with the interests of folks like Senator Feinstein, who's all over this issue, a lot of the cobwebs have come out of the market system. That said, it's not very transparent. It's kind of an inside game, but it shows the possibilities that are out there. And I hope we build off the lessons of the transfers that we've been seeing here in dry years, and not just go back to the usual never mind when it starts raining again.
I think it's key to recognize that those transfers are temporary. They're more the nature of a lease than they are the acquisition of a property right. And that makes all the difference in the world, because that same commodity may not exist next year because of a drought. So to buy a water right takes on a whole different notion. The other problem, it not only has environmental impact when you enter into these kind of leases, it all depends on the governance structure of that particular. David and I have a couple of districts we know of very well within the Colorado River system where those kind of leases are almost impossible, just because the farmer who owns the water will receive the financial benefit. The consequences will be felt by someone else. And so that social order and how those districts are structured is very, very key on whether or not that kind of a temporary transaction can occur or not.
Okay, I think we're come to the point where it's appropriate to ask for a question, comment from the floor. So please wait for a microphone to reach you. We'll go here first. Oh, no, we're going to go here first. Okay.
I got the mic. This is a factual question for Patricia. You mentioned some numbers about the amount of water that comes down the Colorado system and the Mississippi system. And if you know them, would you mind repeating those numbers? And in round numbers, how does that compare to the Sacramento, San Joaquin, and the Columbia system? And what part of that water goes to sea in each of those systems? It's about zero in the Colorado system, I guess, nowadays.
Not anymore. No, there's one. In fact, we had a deliberate release to the Colorado River Delta this year. Okay, I'm not well versed enough in the San Joaquin, Sacramento.
You mentioned the Colorado and Mississippi.
Right, and I've heard 80 million acre feet for the Columbia. It was 436 million for where the Mississippi and the Missouri come together. And 18 million was the amount they assumed when the compact was negotiated. Now there's a range, anywhere on the Colorado from 9 to 14. Going over 14, you're getting into water that doesn't really exist. So the river was over appropriated right from the get-go.
So it's like a normal year, 13, 12 or so.
Yeah, about 12 million, 13 million, 14 million if we're lucky.
And the Mississippi, much more percentage goes into the ocean than the Colorado.
Correct.
Yes.
Yes, Pat, you just been to Dubai, so you must have had some encounter with desalination. And I know there's a plant coming on board in San Diego that's going to supply water for about 300,000 people. I know it's small and it's expensive, but I believe California has to face this without being in a closed loop. I think this outside-the-box thinking has to be, and perhaps very wealthy communities like Santa Barbara can decide to do it on a small scale. You've talked about regional impact and the sort of ultimately the synergies of people taking different options. Could you comment on desalination?
Oh, absolutely. I said that there was a mosaic of infrastructure that had to come together. And I think that mosaic very much includes desal, and it also includes water reuse projects, carefully applied. It includes conservation. It includes the entire spectrum. I don't think we can afford right now to take anything off the table. Now, desal, people see it as a panacea, but it's not. Let's be very honest about what it is. Unless you make the conscious decision that you're going to build a nuclear power plant there. In order to desalt 1 million acre-feet takes a nuclear power plant. I don't know where in California you feel comfortable putting a nuclear power plant. That's a question I leave to Californians. Other than that, it is going to very much be smaller pieces of the mosaic. All important pieces, because you want a diversified portfolio of where your water comes from. But one of my frustrations, and with ceramic filters, I think we've come a ways of being able to shut them on and off much better. But I've often thought that perhaps the best thing to do is leave the desalter on as a permanent supply, build that cost into the rate base, and allow those sometimes they're not there, natural freshwater sources to fill in from the sides. We are looking at it backwards. And the stranded investment that's going on in Australia right now, Sydney mothballing its desalter, Adelaide mothballing its desalter, is counterintuitive to me. Use your freshwater resources, store them in groundwater basins and in other areas, and take that desalter and embed it into your base and make it a permanent source of supply, and avoid that cost of turning it off and turning it on, because that's a huge cost factor in and of itself.
If I'm not mistaken, you mentioned Santa Barbara. That's a mothballed, stranded investment. The plant was built at great cost some years ago. I believe it has never been brought online.
And it cost several $1 million to bring it up and several $1 million to bring it down.
It makes no sense.
It's
Just bite the bullet.
The cost is pretty phenomenal because, intuitively it seems like a great idea, but the acre-foot cost for desal is about $2,500 an acre-foot. For reuse of municipal water to bring it to tap water is about half of that. And then actually the California market until this year, the high-priced water for LA Basin was like $400 an acre-foot. So the economics of desal are really high. I think Pat raises an interesting point, but it gets to the problem of pricing and whether you've got a governance structure that can do what probably does make sense, which is to have some dedicated desal supply.
And as a final thought, for that to become a community or local resource makes less financial sense than making it a regional resource. That's where everything we've talked about in terms of larger projects, larger usability of the project, where the cost effectiveness that really comes home is in the desalter. I mean, look at the large ones that Israel's built. It's for the whole country. That's why they were able to do it. The federal government subsidizes those plants enormously. Metropolitan pays nothing to take desal. It's all embedded in the federal tax structure.
Dr. DeBusk.
The ownership of the water seems to be at the center of this discussion. Traditionally, it's been private. If the river flows through my farm, if the water falls on my farm, it's mine.
Not
At
Nevada.
what point? Now, we have a precedent for the taking of land for public use. How soon in California and in the country will we get to the point of having public takings for water?
I'm moving to
How do we
Germany.
deal with the communities in the Central Valley who are now subsisting on bottled water? That's not politically sustainable, but I haven't heard that explicitly discussed today so far in terms of legal policy or discussion.
California is a hodgepodge of water law. You're part riparian, you're part prior appropriation. In most of the other West, I own an acre of land. I have no right to any water, either under my land or that goes through my land. I have to get a permit from the state engineer, a water right that is completely detached from the land. That is the majority of the West. It is completely prior appropriation. You guys in California are very different in that way. That you're partly riparian with the idea that if you own the land, you own the water on it and underneath it, which is East Coast and Old British law, or the concept of ownership is no one in the state of Nevada owns their water. They have a right to use it, and they lose it for non-use.
So effectively, it's a political issue, and California could address it in the same way if we had the means and the will.
Well, the California is complex, but the bottom line is it's not dissimilar. You're right, it's essentially a private right, but it is not a complete right. It is subject to being limited by environmental requirements, like the Endangered Species Act, and there have been plenty of takings cases brought by private water rights holders saying you can't take the water. By and large, the environment has won on those, but they're, but you see in a drought situation that obviously your water right is contingent and not complete. But this is I think that most folks have accepted the fact that this is a private water right, and the way to move water around is to pay for it and to pay off those who have the high water rights, the highest priority water rights in California on the Colorado River back from the late 20s, like the Imperial Irrigation District, pay about $15 an acre foot for their water, basically for free. They get to sell it to San Diego for $400 or $500 an acre foot. Rather than try to bust up the legal system, the decision was made. We're going to deal with it like a contract right. It is one of the constraints, but we live in a system of laws, and there we are.
Patricia.
When we were with Secretary Babbitt, one of the things that he was very proud of was he was the river master of the Colorado River. Yes. And following up on that gentleman's question, it does seem to me that we need to have a river master that says this is how we're going to allocate the water and have it centralized. And I know from having dealt with the Southern Nevada Water Association, that's not something that was particularly pleasing to them. Do you think that we should have the Secretary of Interior be the river master for the Colorado River?
Oh, Pat, that's such a loaded question. Shame on you. Shame on you. Well, Bruce Babbitt, as you know, Pat, was very, very much aware that although the Supreme Court suggested he's the water master for the lower Colorado, the reality is that there's a shared jurisdiction. And every year when he was secretary, he worked with Joe Sachs and John Leshy and me and a few others to figure out what he was going to say at the annual meeting of the Colorado River Waters Users, and would push a little on Imperial and would push a little on Pat. And I think that's the reality is there is no king almost in any system of water when it comes to managing water supplies. And I think Bruce and the Colorado River is an example that you don't want to push the limits too far. You want to try to get as far as you can with cooperation. That said, Bruce did give some tough messages when he had to, and used the fact that he did have that authority. And you do need that stick. And part of the problem with the thousands of water agencies is that no one has a stick that can bring them together in many contexts.
Right. But just to be completely right, he has the water master role only in the lower basin. The upper basin, he never became, and the only reason he's the water master in the lower basin is as a consequence of Arizona v. California. Had that lawsuit never happened, he wouldn't be the water master in the lower basin either. And the upper basin will fight for the next 100 years in the Supreme Court to keep the Secretary of Interior out. It's just the way it is.
Please.
Angela Nomolini. In further defense of rice, I'd like to point out that California has lost 90% of its wetlands. So flooded rice fields act as an important part of the migratory bird system. And not only is desalination not a panacea because of the cost, but you got to figure out what you're going to do with all that salt
Yes.
that's left over. That was addressed at the Woods Institute, or not addressed at the Woods Institute, but the question was brought up about how does the increasing salination of the sea around the desalination plants affect fish life and those other issues. And then lastly, I know this is like, I think, in northern Nevada, but how does the Tesla Gigabyte factory factor into water usage up there? It seems like Elon Musk picked 4 or at least 3 rather bad sites for his future factory.
Well, actually, I asked that very same question, and predominantly it's going to be reuse water. Predominantly it's going to be treated wastewater, and they're going to invest in the necessary facilities to do that. And as a personal note, I'm much more comfortable using reuse for that kind of application than to grow agriculture with, or because of endocrine disruptors and pharmaceuticals. There's more that we don't know than we do know, and it's scary to me.
So as it happens, we have in the room the director of the Water in the West project, which is a joint project between the Bill Lane Center for the American West and the Woods Institute for the Environment. And we also have a partner, as it happens, at Sydney University in Australia in that project. And Australia, as many people here will know, is the driest inhabited continent. And the western part of North America is the driest part of our continent. Among the reasons why Australia has a certain attraction for us is we share technologies and regulatory and legal issues and so on. Leon, you're going to correct me if I've got this wrong, but I believe after the 6-year drought in Australia recently, the Australian government essentially extinguished all local water rights in the Missouri-Darling system and just decreed a holistic basin-wide management system of the kind that for legacy, historical, legal, political, federalist reasons we find very difficult to do. So would you, Leon, just like you to maybe say a little something about what the Water in the West project's all about, in particular whether the Australian example has any bearing on what we do?
So I'll address the point about Australia first. What Australia did in the Murray-Darling Basin is they fundamentally changed the nature of the water rights, and they changed it to a share of the available water. So every farmer now knows he has a certain percentage share of the available water, and if it's a drought and say there's 40% of normal is available, that farmer knows he gets 40% of his normal allocation. So that it creates a lot more predictability, and that water right, which is very certain, is much easier to transfer, so they have very active water markets. But as David said, we have a completely different legal system here. There are very strong property rights, and it's really quite difficult to imagine without a huge amount of litigation and upheaval overhauling our water rights system in the same way. So that's the quick Australia example. I'm not sure which other question was, David.
Just a brief description of what the Water in the West project is doing.
So we have a program that does interdisciplinary research, fosters interdisciplinary research on Western water issues. Some of the things we're working on include, as David mentioned, we're doing a lot of work on groundwater, and particularly California groundwater policy, so looking at things like the cost of aquifer recharge compared to storage. We're looking at issues like what are the best, it's very fragmented in California, local groundwater management is critically important. What are the best practices in California that result in better groundwater management? We're looking at things like water pricing, so can you create pricing structures that really change the way people use water? That's a big part of our research, and it's not necessarily affiliated with our program, but there is some work going on in Stanford about desalination and this issue of brine and how dense brine is and how hard it is to move once you put it in the ocean, and looking at what circumstances the brine will dissipate and its environmental effects will be dissipated. So that's just a little sampling of what we do. Can I ask a question now that you've given me the microphone?
Since I put you on the spot, you have every right to ask a question.
So I was really, I go to a lot of things like this where people talk about water, and David's absolutely right, almost including the Brookings Stanford thing that was a few weeks ago. Every one of these things you go to, everybody talks about prices. If you actually charged for water what it was worth and what the cost of taking it out of the river was, that would solve, that's almost more than desal, I think, considered a panacea to the West's water problems, is pricing it correctly. And I'll just give one example. I was interested to hear Dr. Foley say that Israel has the most efficient water use. I learned recently that Israel charges its farmers 40 cents a cubic meter for their water, which I all by myself, converted to $493 an acre foot, which for a lawyer I think is not bad, which is a lot, and it's one of the reasons their water is so efficient. But what I'm really curious about in the context of these large infrastructure projects, like the Colorado River and Lake Mead and the Central Valley Project, what role does pricing play in reallocating water in those projects? Because so much of that is water wholesaling or driven by federal rules about what you can charge for water under the Reclamation Act, and whether changing the price that the customers of those large water projects pay for their water could pay either in enhancing the infrastructure or fundamentally changing the way water is allocated in those larger systems.
You do like going to the Holy Grails, don't you? The state's perspective is that's really state water. And the infrastructure that was built in the Colorado system is being paid for by the power users. That's where the burden for repayment rests. We pay 50 cents an acre foot to take water, but all the infrastructure to take it out is ours. And the same holds true for Met and CAP. I mean, they take it from Lake Havasu. The power users are paying for the maintenance of the larger system, and Met and CAP pay for the infrastructure that brings it to them. That would be a real, I'm not sure that war is worth fighting. It's not going to get us anywhere.
You want to add anything, David?
No.
Jonathan, do you
That's why he did real well as assistant
do you have any
secretary.
final thoughts, Jonathan? John, is there any final thoughts? Pat, any final thoughts?
Nope, I think we covered it.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists for wonderful presentations.